Hello friends, welcome to the M.A.R.E podcast. Before we get started, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Don't forget that you can find more about the M.A.R.E project at www.marehamburg.com, and you can support the project and this podcast through Patreon. All the links are in the description. Enjoy! Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the M.A.R.E podcast. It is a pleasure to welcome Leo tonight or today in our podcast. I met Leo when I was doing my master's because Leo was also doing their master's in Maritime Archaeology at the University of Oxford. And I invited Leo here today to talk a bit about their research, which I find fascinating. But before we get to that, hello Leo, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me on the podcast.
It is a pleasure to have you here. So where are you now in the world? You are in Canada, right?
Yes, I am in Canada. I'm back home in Ottawa, which is, of course, the capital of Canada and the home of all of the government agencies here.
Nice. So you are, I think, second Canadian I have here, right? I think the first one was Ella. That was Ella. You know Ella, yeah.
Yes.
So you're back in Canada. You're back home. Tell us why you're home. What are you doing right now?
Yeah, so I kind of knew that this was going to be the case while I was still at Oxford, when I was interacting with the local underwater archaeology team for Parks Canada, which is, again, the government agency. They're basically the only team in Canada that does underwater archaeology. So I, of course, got in touch with them before I even started my degree. And they invited me to come on and start writing some reports that needed to get written. And so I came back from Oxford and essentially started right away with them. And I'm still there now, about 6 or 7 months later.
Very nice. And then Parks Canada, I think it's a very famous in the UK for their finds of like the British ships in the Arctic, right? I think I remember
so
the underwater talking about it.
The underwater archaeology team is the team that discovered Franklin's ships, so HMS Erebus and HMS Terror in 2014 and 2016, respectively. So that sort of blew them up on a global scale. But of course, I was like 12 when they found Erebus, so I was not involved in that at all.
Yeah, but I mean, you're involved with them now, and you never know what they're going to find next, right? I imagine.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, as I said before, the reason I invited you here is because I wanted to talk a bit about your research, which the research you've done for your master's thesis, which I quite enjoyed reading about. So before I start, do you want to talk to us a bit about what you did for your master's thesis?
Sure. So my master's thesis was not necessarily focused on underwater archaeology as such. I kind of took the creative approach to the maritime theme. But I'd always been super interested since undergrad in the archaeology of children. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted to incorporate that into my final thesis. So what I ended up doing was looking at toy boats. So there's, they're ships in a way, but they're very small and probably don't, you can't sail on them. And I looked at those in the Viking age because I was very curious. The Vikings, martial culture, warriors, conquerors, essentially. How do you make a child fit the mold of a society like this through toys and through play? And of course, being a very maritime culture, obviously boats were going to be incorporated into that. Boats were their vehicles of war. So I looked at the toy boats, some in Norway, some in Ireland, and thought a little bit about how that would help construct an identity of essentially a future warrior.
Very nice. Yes, exactly. So let's start from the beginning. Archaeology of children. It's something we don't talk about enough, especially in the maritime archaeology context. But I think overall, when did like archaeology of children start picking up in like archaeology trends? Do you remember approximately? It's recent, right, or not?
Yeah. So basically, in the late 1980s, at the absolute earliest, early 90s, kind of that time, Lillehammer's work really sort of kicked it off. Essentially, she was a very important scholar in that field. And even then, it's been still 40, 45 years, I guess, at this point, or maybe more like 30, 35. But even so, it's still very much off to the side, not really considered by a lot of archaeologists. And as you say, in maritime especially, there's really not a lot of overlap there, I guess, which is weird because, I mean, if you think of just the British Navy, there were 12-year-olds on the ships in the 19th century, right? So it's like there were kids there all the time. But it's just not something that we think of very often. A big problem that came up, and comes up a lot, basically, in the archaeology of children. And with my research specifically, was the idea of miniatures. You could find something and maybe it's a toy, but a lot of people might think, oh, it's a miniature, it's a ritual object for, ritual ceremonies and religious activities, but it's, maybe it's just a little toy for a little kid.
No, I mean, you can imagine how, I can imagine how difficult it is to trace children in the archaeological record, right? Because I think I kind of have this thing in my head that you can only see children if they pass away young, kind of in maybe a prehistoric context, or like a context where we don't have maybe written sources. But maybe that's not the case, as you say, that you can trace it through other means.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true to a certain extent, where, most children eventually just grow up and become adults, and then they're just adults when they die. So, of course, the graves of children are super important archaeologically. And a lot of the trouble, especially something that I kind of considered with my research, is that so many toys that a kid would use are ephemeral. Maybe I was thinking of toy swords as another, tool for warrior culture toys and play. But you can just pick up a stick and start hitting your friend with it. You're small. You don't have time to sort of carve a wooden sword that looks perfect. So you just pick up some stick in the woods and boom, there you go. And then you just toss it aside when you're done. That's not going to be visible in the archaeological record.
No.
So those are some of the things that are kind of considered where we simply don't know.
Absolutely, not at all. But at the same time, you talk about constructing kind of this narrative, this kind of like, I don't know if I could say very manly narrative of Vikings, right? That they're this warrior kind of clan, and you kind of try to trace how the children grew up in this environment to become that. So first I want to take a step back and ask you the very general question. Do you think that what they say about the Vikings is 100% representative of what their culture actually looked like? Were they indeed just this bloodthirsty clan of people that, I don't know, ravaged and attacked and killed? Is this because me myself, I'm not very familiar with Viking archaeology, so I think you're much more familiar than me. So is this something like super representative of what they really were?
I mean, to a certain extent, absolutely. A lot of the written historical sources that we have about the Norse, let's say, come from people that they were attacking, and so they were probably, of course, biased because their villages were being pillaged and burned, and they were quite frightened. But they were there; they were being attacked, and we know this very well. For example, in Oxford, where we have graves of Viking invaders, essentially, from over 1,000 years ago. And so it's definitely a case of, yes, they were out here pillaging, burning, attacking. But of course, a lot of the people back home, back in Scandinavia, for example, they were just farmers, so they weren't exactly out there warring most of the time. They were out there dealing with their sheep, for example. And it's interesting as well, I found that you used the word manly, because one of the things that I pointed out in my dissertation was the idea that maybe girls were involved in this type of play as well, because of course we have these questions of shield maidens in the Viking literature. Were women involved in this sort of pillaging and fighting as well? And most signs point to yes at this point. But another difficult thing in the archaeological record is most of the time we don't know who was the child that this toy boat was made for example. Maybe it was made for a boy, maybe he had a little sister who used it as well, or maybe it was made for her in the first place. And those are the sort of things that I was interested in addressing, these questions of, was this part of a girl's childhood as well, as sort of preparing to enter this kind of culture?
It would make sense, right? Because kids being kids, if you remove the social constructs that we put onto children today, I think if a girl sees a boat, girls plays with the boat. It does, like, I don't know. I feel like in a child's mind, it doesn't. It's not necessarily a boys thing or a girls thing. It's something that's interesting, so they engage with it, right?
Exactly. And that's the problem with, I mean, archaeology is done by adults, right? And the toys,
Indeed.
a lot of toys are made by adults for children. And maybe an adult has their own expectations of what the toy that they make is going to be used, is who it's going to be used by, first of all, and how it's going to be used. But we've all been children. We know that sometimes you find a toy and you're not using it for its intended purpose, in quotation marks. You might find a more creative way of doing it because you're a kid and you have a big imagination. But those are the
Yeah.
sort of things that we just, if it's not written down in the historical record, how can we see it in the archaeological record? Because again, you might find a miniature, you might find a toy and think, oh, religious artifacts.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I cannot even think of a way of kind of separating girls' toys from boy toys, because you pointed two difficult things out. Like, first of all, we need to separate toys from the archaeological record and like label them as toys, that these are toys. And then it goes a level deeper when it's like, is this a girl's toy or a boy's toy, or does it matter if it's either?
Yeah,
So
and I mean,
yeah,
sorry, one thing I think of today that's quite interesting is, go to a toy store and there'll be big bright pink box with a little Barbie in it or something. And you might think, oh, well, that's obviously a girl's toy. But then a family might bring it home and maybe they have a little son, and then the son's like, oh, this kind of rocks. And then the son is playing with it, but it's still, is it a girl's toy because it was made for a girl in theory, but it's being used by a boy. So the
exactly.
gender question sort of came up quite a lot when I was thinking about my research.
Yeah, and I mean, how can we define a toy as like a girl's toy? What makes a toy a girl's toy and not a boy's toy? Like,
Exactly.
is
I
it
mean,
what we expect the kid to perceive by it, kind of thing?
I honestly don't think there really is a way to define it, at least not archaeologically. But I think, today, again, thinking of marketing and packaging and advertising, it would definitely be the intention behind the toy because, of course, again, they're not made by kids. They're made by adults to be sold to families with children. So a Barbie, for example, becomes a girl's toy because that's how it's sold. That's how it's marketed to be for girls. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to always be a girl's toy once it's out there in the world, having been sold and being played with.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And I think that this makes sense in our archaeological context as well, in a Viking context. Kind of, if an adult builds or creates a toy, and they want both boys and girls to play with it, they will not have this kind of very gender specific attributes to it. I don't know if that's even real. That doesn't even make sense. I mean, how would you define it? So maybe let's talk with more specifics. So you talked about boat toys. So how many toy boats do we have in the archaeological record? Which parts of the world have you like surveyed and seen and discussed? Is it as a very specific place, or is it like anywhere that Vikings lived?
So for my research, I only looked at 2 toy boats. I only looked at those 2 because I wanted to focus quite closely on the different differences between them, similarities, the contexts of how they were found, and sort of those sorts of things, as opposed to a more general survey where I looked at all the toy boats that have ever been found in the whole world, which, could be quite a few. One thing that definitely came up while I was looking is the context of where they were found. They were found in more domestic areas. One of them was found in Ireland, and it was in a more bedroom context, sort of a living quarters of an old house that was being excavated archaeologically. And the other was found at the bottom of a well on a farm in Norway. And so one of the questions that came up with that second one, the one at the bottom of the well, as, ritual deposition at the, bottom of a well, what could this possibly mean? But for me, one of the things that I immediately thought of seeing that is, well, sometimes maybe you're a kid and you get mad and you're mad and all you have is your toy to take your anger out on. So boom, you throw it down the well and no one can play with it anymore. So that was one of the things that I sort of thought of, but not necessarily any scholastic evidence behind that. But
it was a well, right? So it had water in it. So I can
Yes.
imagine a kid being like, let's put the boat in the water and just throwing it in there. And we're like, where's the boat now? And
It's
like,
now
and
it's a shipwreck.
yeah, yeah, and an angry parent comes up like, where did you throw that boat? Why did you do that?
Yeah.
Wow. So okay, so you said that you believe that those things are that we usually label them as ritual objects, which is the easiest thing to say, or like, I don't know, decoration of rooms. But you believe that these were used by children as toys. Is there something specific that makes you say that? Or is it kind of like you think of as easy as it is for you to say it's a ritual object, it's the same for me saying it's a toy? Or is it something very specific in their, like, I don't know, material character that makes them toys?
Yeah. So one of the things that came up during my research as well was the idea of how do you distinguish a miniature that was maybe made by an adult for perhaps a ritual, but also perhaps for decoration or just for showing off their skills at making something small. And that was the idea that there is the full-sized object, which for a ship is pretty big, and then a miniature, which is really, really small, usually, typically shows up as very, very small. And then the toy is sort of somewhere in between, where it's a little bit, it's bigger than a proper miniature, maybe a foot
Mhm.
long was about how long the toy boats in question typically were. And also, the toy boats that I was looking at were typically not super fancy, super ornate. They weren't very, high detail. Each plank is perfectly carved out
Mm.
in masterful detail and that sort of thing. And so, for those reasons, that sort of in between size, the domestic context of the finds, as well as the amount of effort, I guess, I guess we could say,
Yeah.
that was put into the construction. Those are some of the things that sort of led me to conclude, yeah, these are probably for kids to play with.
Yeah. I mean, this it makes sense. It definitely makes sense to kind of talk about. I mean, the way you put it, like it was found in domestic context. It wasn't super detailed. So I imagine if it's for kind of a religious purpose, they may have, put some more effort into it rather than just carving out a piece of wood and calling it a boat. So my next question is, how certain are we that these are boats and not anything else? How do we know that these are? Because I don't have an like. I think I have an image in my head of how it looked like, and I remember it looks like a curved piece of wood, right? But it did. I think it had some details that distinguish it as a boat and not just as a curved piece of wood, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they have clear decks. I think at least one of them
Mhm.
has what appears to be a deck, and holes carved into that deck for a mast. The mast would have been there 1,000 years ago, but of course, very delicate piece. It's gone. And same with the sail. We can assume there was a little piece of cloth on it to act as the sail. And there are also holes carved into one of them, at least, that was there for what was even the word for a steering oar, I
Helm,
believe.
helm,
Um, no,
not
it's not. It's sort of
okay. I don't know.
it's sort of behind the stern.
Yeah,
I can't even really
steering
describe.
oar. I think steering oar is the correct word.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it was, but it's
Yeah,
been
sure, sure.
since
Yeah.
I looked at my all my pictures. Um, so yes, so those details are quite unmistakable. It was a toy boat.
All right. So you talked about these two boats, and you said we can't talk about every toy that was found because there's too many of them. So is there like a huge corpus of like boat toys,
So
or?
I was obviously looking at Viking age toy boats,
Mhm.
and for the most part, the two that I was looking at are the ones that have received the most attention, which is to say not much, but still more than the others. But there are mentions of collections of toy boats, or not even necessarily toys in this case, but small boats that were
Mhm.
found in Trondheim, for example. And some of those have quite a range where they go from quite ornate in terms of their design to very crude. And that crudeness is quite interesting as well, because I mentioned the sort of quality of the construction as perhaps one of the clues that they were toys. And something that comes up a lot in the archaeology of children is this idea that how do we tell if a child made something? And oftentimes the answer is, well, it kind of doesn't look very good. It kind of looks clumsy and poorly made. And so these clumsy toy boats, you don't obviously want to say, well, if it looks bad, then a child made it. But it is also entirely possible that there were some children who were being taught, ship
Yeah.
construction in miniature with these small boats, and then maybe you play with it after.
Yeah, it makes sense. So another important question that I forgot to ask, and I don't know the answer to, is how do you define a child? Like, what is a child?
Exactly.
Like,
Very
I
complicated.
mean, in a kind of a sense of until what age is one considered a child, and then they become teenagers?
Yeah, and that is something that has changed throughout history across
Mhm.
space. It really depends, to be honest. So I think up until about 1 or 2 years old, you're an infant, you're a baby. You're not
Yeah,
expected to be doing anything or really
yeah,
learning very much at that point. So I think before that, you don't really count as a child just yet. But then once you're walking around, once you're talking and you can play with toys, then you
mm,
become a child. You're expected to be learning, especially in these historical contexts where learning often meant you're going to be figuring out what you're doing for the rest of your life, basically, whether
yeah,
that be farming or soldiering or
mhm,
ruling, those
mhm,
are the sorts of things. But this question of when you stop being a child
yeah,
is very complicated. A lot
yeah,
of the times, it might depend. Like right now, in most of the modern world, we say 18, you become an adult, you can vote, whatever. But obviously, there's a transitional stage where you're 16, now you can drive. Maybe in the US, you're 21, now you can drink alcohol, or
mhm.
allegedly. But
That
those are the sorts of things where you have this sort of, you're an adult, but you can't do this yet, or you've been doing this already for a little while, and you're sort of more adult behaviors. But historically, it often depended on, especially if you were a girl, are you married yet? Are you becoming of marriageable age? For a girl, can you have children? That becomes obviously a big, very obvious moment
Okay.
in your life. And then maybe that makes you an adult. Whereas if you're a boy, a male child, that becomes a bit more nebulous. Are you growing your beard yet? Are you going off on a boat with maybe your uncle, your dad, and you're going off to join them in their battles and their expeditions, and then that sort of makes you're a man now.
Yeah.
But there is some disagreement, especially in the historical sources, about what makes someone an adult. Um, and so that was definitely something that came up quite a bit in my research, was how am I defining child
Mm,
in these contexts? So yeah, it's a hard question, and there's not really a single answer at any point.
yeah,
Even within the Viking Age, it changed occasionally. So,
yeah, I
but
imagine.
children under 12 couldn't be charged with murder. They couldn't be held accountable for murder. So that was something that, if you're under 12, you are not liable if you kill someone. So that clearly means they didn't consider you a fully mature human being just yet. That's the
Yeah,
closest answer I can give.
but at the same time, if there was a law that under 12 you can be persecuted, I imagine that it happened that people under 12 they
They
murdered
had a
people.
lot of swords lying around in that time. Anything can happen.
Wow, wow, amazing. So let's maybe dive a bit deeper now and talk about this, as you said, this narrative, this construction of a narrative when it comes to like boys or girls or both, or like how. So can you maybe expand a bit on how do you perceive this construction of society or like societal identity in the Viking Age based on toys? So what did you think their parents or their guardians tried to achieve by giving these children like toy boats or any other toys? I don't know if there are other toys that we found like swords and stuff.
Yeah, so I think especially with boats, it's because the warfare for the most part of Vikings involved you hop on a boat and you sail to a different place and you pillage and then you sail back home
Mm,
with all your new stuff. And so the boats especially were the vehicle of war, but they were also very commonplace. Here's how you get from place to place. And so getting a child used to that idea, used to, here's what a boat looks like, here's how it works. You've got a little sail on your toy boat so that you kind of get the idea of how it's moving around. Maybe if you're a child learning how to make one of these toy boats, then perhaps it's a bit easier to wrap your head around building a full-size boat when the time comes. And so these things were all, I believe, the purpose of the toy boats, just, you know, figuring out how does this new world that I'm in with full of boats and fighting, how does that all work, and how do I fit into that? Something interesting in the sagas, for example, that came up was there's this one character, and he sees when he's visiting this lord, he sees the lord's son playing by the fire with a little toy boat, and then when he leaves, the boy gives him his toy boat, and eventually he is able to build a full-size boat basing it off of the toy. So I'm not sure how historically accurate that description is, because of course the sagas are not, you know, documentaries, but the idea that they would have thought of something like that, you know, maybe does indicate that there was some connection between ship construction and the toys that they were playing with as kids.
Wow. I mean, that's superbly interesting. So another thing that comes to mind, another question that comes to mind is, how do you consider this toy boats as part of the overall kind of artistic world of the Vikings? Or do you think it's like, this is not art per se, this is something else, and so this is not part of like the artistic world of them? And also, like, as a follow-up question, are there any iconographic representations of like Viking children?
So to answer the first part of your question about the art, that's a very good question. I am honestly not sure, because I would consider it artistic, you know, to be able to have the skill of carving a piece of wood to look like a real thing. I probably couldn't do a very good job of doing that, you know.
Oh, me neither.
But whether or not they would have thought of it as an artistic endeavor is a different question, I think. You know, Viking artwork, we can see it, for example, in something like a runestone, where they've carved ships, perhaps, you know, ships show up in stone carvings, or religious depictions of, you know, gods and monsters and things like that. But a toy boat or a miniature boat even, I don't know. I mean, for something like a miniature boat, it might be a bit more obvious of a yes, just because those were not necessarily built to serve as toys. They were built to sort of show off your skills at being able to carve more detailed miniature pieces of wood into looking like a full-size fancy ship. For example, with figureheads that show up in the record. But as for toys, I don't know. Would you say, like, it's sort of the question of if a little girl has a doll that her mom made for her, whatever, does that doll become part of an artistic collect? You know, I don't know. I don't think so.
There's no answer. I mean, I don't know the answer.
It's sort of like asking me to define art, which is a question that's never been answered to my satisfaction.
I mean, yeah. Anyway, but let's not define art right now. Let's not.
That's a whole different discussion.
That would derail the conversation way too much. So,
but as for the second question about if I've found any iconographic depictions of children in Viking artwork, the answer is no. I didn't see any. I have not found any in my research, but I can't say they don't exist. I can't say that they're not out there. I just might not have found them, to be honest.
Ah, that's very interesting. So how many people are like interested in this subject of Viking children? Like this, I think it's a very niche kind of like place in archaeology, like it's Viking children. Is it like a community of people researching that, or is it like generally people interested not in Viking archaeology and they just do it?
I mean, it's definitely not none. I found in my research there were a few, and I would give you their names if I could remember them, or if I had checked my bibliography before I hopped on this.
Don't worry. I mean, you can always just send later. I could put it in like the description of the video.
Yeah, but there are a few, and there are, of course, some more sort of general Viking Age archaeologists or Viking Age scholars who have kind of touched on the idea of children, because you kind of know, you know, if you're looking at a society or its greater context historically, you know the children were there, you know how they were treated, how they behaved, you know they were important. But it's not necessarily going to be something that you fixate on quite to the extent of the archaeology of children as a way of looking at it. So yeah, it doesn't come up super often, I will say.
Very fair. So what before we go there, another interesting question is, do you plan on publishing your work?
My dissertation, you mean?
Yeah, as in the form of like a journal paper or like a, I don't know, chapter somewhere, something like that. Is it in your plans?
No, no, it is not. I know you did,
Why?
I think, but I don't know. I'm not, you know.
I mean,
I,
there's no me judging you for not doing it. This is an overall question of like, are people interested in publishing their work, or are they doing it and then they just get over it and like move on with their lives? It's like a more of a general question rather than being like, can you please publish it?
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting. I really enjoy the subject,
Hmm.
and I think my some of my conclusions are pretty interesting. But to be honest, I think it would need quite a bit of work if I wanted to publish it, and I'm over it at this point, to be honest.
Wow. Yeah. So what could you, I don't know if you, I don't remember if we talked about this. I honestly remember, I mean, the blackouts are coming back, but like, what got you interested in Viking archaeology? Why Viking archaeology?
So I'll go back to my undergrad for this one. So I did my
Yeah.
undergrad in Newfoundland at the Memorial University, and Newfoundland, as you may know, has the site of the first and possibly only Norse site in North America, um, because of course they were living in Iceland and then they were living in Greenland. And then they came hopping down the Canadian coastline and set up at Losso Meadows in Newfoundland. So a lot of my professors at Memorial were very interested in sort of Icelandic archaeology, Norse archaeology, and the archaeology of Newfoundland, obviously in general, including Losso Meadows. And some of my professors did work and hosted field schools at Losso Meadows. And so just the availability, I guess, of that to me in undergrad sort
Mhm.
of really got me compelled. And then, of course, we also had the archaeology of children as an offering in my undergrad. So those two sort of happening at the same time, I guess, got all tangled up in my brain. And I was like, I want to do both of these things.
Very nice. So does Memorial University have like a maritime archaeology specific kind of stream, or is that something you chose afterward?
Yeah, so surprisingly, no. And actually, nowhere in Canada offers maritime archaeology, which is a bit surprising considering how much coastline we have. And also for Memorial specifically, it's in St. John's, it's on the ocean. I was kind of hoping maybe it would be nice. They did hire a maritime archaeologist the year after I left. So that was unlucky timing. Um, but there are lots of the professors are interested in, again, coastal archaeology or the archaeology of various maritime cultures. Um, of course, lots of the indigenous groups who have lived in Newfoundland historically have been super reliant on the ocean to survive. The earliest group living there, of course, literally was called the Maritime Archaic because of all the maritime animals, mammals, birds, fish that show up in their archaeological sites. And then, of course, once the Europeans start showing up, those were lots of Basque whalers and fishermen. So it's always been that sort of reliance on the ocean, but there's no maritime specific kind of
Hmm.
looking at shipwrecks in the way that maybe we think of it.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is very important. And I think because someone might be listening who is interested in the subject but doesn't know where to study the subject, is that you don't really need to hold a degree that says maritime in it in order to study communities that like had to do with water at this point. I mean, it's not like if your degree doesn't say maritime in it, you are not allowed to talk about ships or people, boats or people where have to do with the like the maritime aspect of things. Because as you said, the people living in Newfoundland, for example, it was part of their everyday lives. So it's not something you can really avoid. But maybe we're thinking of maritime archaeology as kind of like in a more traditional sense of like, I don't know, a ship that carried something and it sunk and we swim to find it, we go diving to find it. But anyway, staying on the same subject, would you like, how does the undergrad in Memorial University look like? So if someone was interested in studying archaeology in Canada, would you suggest they go there? How does the program look like? What do you have to do? How many years is it?
Yeah, so it's 4 years, which is typical, I think, of everywhere in North America, and is surprised, which is why I was surprised when I went to Oxford and found out their undergrads are only 3 years. It's like, what are you doing? Speed running. But Memorial is sort of unique in Canada. It's not the only one to have this, but it is one of the few where if you want to do archaeology, they have a department of archaeology. For most Canadian universities, it's anthropology. And so you have a degree in anthropology, but there are maybe, archaeologists who will be your professors, and you can do some classes about archaeology and maybe even do field work. But if you want to get a degree in archaeology, Memorial is one of the places where you can actually do that, because our anthropology and archaeology departments sort of split up in the early 2000s, I believe, if my timeline is correct. So archaeology sort of seceded from the anthropology department. But I knew right away going in what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do my major in archaeology. So I was able to get started on that right away when I was 18 in my first year, and then just kind of carried on right through. Whereas a lot of people will start in North America with a first year sort of undeclared major. You don't necessarily know right away what you want to study, but in my case, it's a pretty easy choice.
No, that's very nice. So did you have to write a thesis for your undergrad or not?
I did, but that was only a choice. That was because I was doing my honors degree, which means I was taking way more archaeology courses than, for example, if I had just been doing it as a straight up major, I wouldn't have written a thesis and I wouldn't have taken quite so many credits in archaeology. But I mean, me, I'm a big archaeology fan.
So me.
It's like if there's an opportunity for more archaeology, I'm taking it. So I did my honors.
Very nice. Of course, as you should. So when you say I'm studying archaeology in Canada, so for example, let me give you an example. For me, studying archaeology in Cyprus, it was mostly like, classical Greece and Egypt and Rome and stuff like that. So how does archaeology look like in an undergraduate level in Canada? Is it the same thing, or is it like you do something completely different?
Yes, so it's pretty different because we have essentially two distinct eras of archaeology in Canada. You have pre-contact Indigenous that you can do, which is pretty similar in practice. Well, and not necessarily in practice, but in results, I guess, to prehistoric European archaeology, where there's a lot of lithics, ceramics, but not necessarily super, huge constructions like a castle or something like that. Of course, you'll find things like longhouses and hearths, and especially, in the US, there will be obviously some pretty big constructions like mounds and things like that. That's sort of a bit reminiscent of ancient Britain. But then, of course, once you get to the 15th and 16th centuries, then the Europeans suddenly show up, and it's more of a sort of colonial historical archaeology where you're looking at things. Suddenly there are different weapons showing up, guns and swords, new animals like horses, for example, show up now, and different clothes, different human remains, different burial practices. And so that is, again, very, very different sort of style. So it really depends on what exactly you want to do here in Canada. If you want to look at more sort of pre-contact Indigenous archaeology, or sort of more historical European, or sort of the interactions between both. And then once, of course, you get to pre-contact, that's, 10 to 20,000 years, depending what part of the country you're in. And so, of course, there's a lot of variation within those as well, and across the country. We have the Arctic, which is very different from the East Coast, which is very different from the prairies, which is very different from the West Coast. So there's really, endless opportunity for, if you're interested in archaeology. There's all kinds.
That sounds exciting. So, but you one day woke up and decided, you know what? I will go to Oxford and do a postgraduate degree. So can you tell me how that came about? Why Oxford of all the other universities?
Sure. So I mentioned before, there's nowhere in Canada really where you can do maritime archaeology. And I had known before I started undergrad that I was like, underwater archaeology? That sounds so cool. I would love to do that. But I knew there was nowhere I could do that in Canada. So I thought, maybe I'll do a postgrad degree one day and then it'll be great. So suddenly the time came around where I was like, oh, I want to do my master's degree. So I want to do it in underwater archaeology of some kind. So looking around at the English-speaking world, different universities that offer potential maritime-centric archaeology degrees, there aren't that many. So
nope, that is true.
Oxford was one of only 2 that I ended up applying for. Um, and that was sort of only, I wasn't super serious necessarily when I applied. I was kind of like, my mom kind of talked me into it a little bit. She's like, you should apply, it'd be so cool if you got in. And I was like, sure, whatever. So I put in my application for that and wasn't really expecting a ton from it. I know I was a good student, but I was like, it's Oxford,
Yeah, you never know what happens, right? Yeah.
But then I got in and I was like, oh, I guess I should go. So the rest is history, as they say. I went.
The rest is history.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you came to the UK and you learned how to dive in the UK, right? So how did that, is it because of archaeology or is it just because you wanted to learn how to scuba dive?
Yeah, so actually that has a very easy answer, where I mentioned before that I had been in touch with the Parks Canada underwater archaeology team before starting my master's. And the big recommendation that I was given from the team was, if you want to sort of make it in Canada in underwater archaeology, learn how to dive. And I had been trying before, because I knew I wanted to do underwater archaeology, but with the pandemic and everything and moving back and forth, it never worked out. And I was like, well, they're going to have a club at Oxford. I'm going to be there for a year. I will finally learn how to dive. And so I did.
Nice. So how is diving in the UK? How is the experience of diving in the UK? And you've done dives in Canada now, or not yet?
So I've done dives in Canada in the pool. Diving in the UK was definitely cold. But that was.
But I mean, you were preparing for Canada, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the people on my team, they do diving in the Arctic and stuff. So the quarry in the UK didn't seem too bad if I thought about that. But of course, it was still tons of fun, even if the water was cold. You get used to your dry suit, and it's not so bad. And there's still some interesting things to see underwater. And it gave me the opportunity as well to go to Naples and do some diving there, which was a bit more classical archaeology, which is not really my thing, but it's still pretty sick. So I had a good time.
It's cool. It's cool stuff to see, right? So, all right. So you've done your master's. You're now working in archaeology, doing stuff. So my natural next question is, do you see yourself doing a PhD?
I hope so. I would really like to one day to do my PhD, because I love school. I love research. My job right now is so much fun because I'm just doing a lot of research and a lot of writing, which I of course really enjoy. But again, the thing is, where in Canada can I do my PhD in maritime archaeology or underwater archaeology?
You want to do it in Canada?
I would probably want to stay. I don't really see myself. I certainly don't see myself going to the US to do it.
All right, yeah.
International students seem to be in a bit of a perilous situation there right now. And as for the UK or going back to Europe, I don't know. I mean, maybe. Who knows what'll happen? But I think it's fair to stay in Canada.
So if you'd said in Canada, but you're not sure where to do it. I mean, it's PhD, right? So again, it doesn't necessarily need to say maritime archaeology. You just need to find someone to work with. So would you want to do it in kind of the same Viking children kind of context, or do you move away from that into something else?
Probably not. I think I would probably try to find something maybe a bit closer to home, just in the sense that I did my Viking Age archaeology. I'm done. But,
I've mastered Viking Age archaeology.
But you're right. You have a point where it's for a PhD, it's a bit more independent. You kind of just need to find someone who will check in with you every once in a while. They're not necessarily being your teacher at that point. So it doesn't necessarily mean I need to find a maritime archaeologist in Canada to be able to be a supervisor. But it's kind of it'd be nice if they knew what I was talking about,
It would be nice, yeah.
So that's one of the things. But at this point, it's different in Canada than maybe it is in a lot of parts of Europe, where the archaeology is, I guess I would say, more competitive almost. And if you want to succeed in a lot of different fields, and if you want to sort of get to the top of the pile, you kind of have to have a PhD in archaeology.
All right, yeah.
Whereas in Canada, that's not really the case at all. Okay,
so you think that, but you still want to do the PhD because you would like to do it. You like research. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that's very interesting. So you see yourself like in the future staying in archaeology, and you're confident that you can stay in archaeology and like make a career out of it.
I would say so.
Mm?
It's not exactly the most stable field to be in, I would say maybe anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But, I'm very passionate about it. And sometimes you just kind of have to hope that that's going to be enough.
I mean, yeah, that's what we all we hope. But it's nice to hear someone say that, you know what, I think I can do it. So, and it's nice to, I mean, I don't know if it's a good idea that you advertise that in Canada you can do it without a how easy is the immigrating to Canada to
Yeah, I mean, just
hey,
for example, on my team, perhaps of a dozen to 15 people at any given time, there's only one person on the team who has a PhD. Let's just put it into,
wow.
numbers like that. So again,
Well,
just kind of goes to show if you don't have a PhD, it's not the end of the world. You can still succeed in
okay.
archaeology.
So another interesting topic that I think we haven't discussed is, haven't we discussed it? It's like, how did you get into archaeology, like out of everything else? Like, why archaeology specifically?
Yeah, so when I was in high school, early on, I wanted to be an astrophysicist. That's what I wanted to do. I love space, I love
Mm.
science. And then I ran into grade 11 math, and I was like, oh, no, I can't do that. But I was also always really interested in history. And the idea of doing history, but hands on, I thought was super cool. So I volunteered on an archaeological dig just basically in Ottawa just to kind of see, do I enjoy doing this? Is this something I can see myself doing in the future? And I had a great time. It was November, it was freezing, it was rainy, and I had a blast. I loved it. And so I was like, oh yeah, I want to do this. And so I think I was about 16 at the time. And when I was volunteering on that site, one of the people who was there was an underwater archaeologist. And I
Mhm.
had never heard of that before. And I thought
Yeah.
that sounded so cool. And so I was like, I want to do that specifically. And I did.
Wow. So you knew you wanted to go into maritime archaeology, like underwater archaeology, before you even started your undergrad. That's like,
That's right.
I mean, that's a rare side. That's, you don't hear that often. So, and then you go and tell your parents, I want to do this. I imagine they were supportive from what you said so far, but were they, or were they like worried that you would
Yeah,
not
yeah,
find
for
job?
sure. No, no, they were very supportive. They've never been like, well, you're never gonna make it in archaeology. Go be an engineer. That's never been kind of the. I mean, they both have degrees in history, so they would not really be able to tell me otherwise.
Oh, yes. So that's interesting. So you come from like this background that both your parents have a degree in history.
Yeah, and my grandfather, who was a history teacher for his entire career, essentially. So I guess a long and storied line of Canadian historians.
Canadian historian. Very nice. So, wow, that's very interesting. So, just to kind of like somehow wrap up this episode, something that interests me a lot, and I think a lot of people talk about is, would you suggest to like someone who's in school right now to go and study archaeology? Do you think it's like, would you suggest it to someone? Would you say that yeah, that's a good field, go and do it, or not?
I would say yes, just because I love archaeology and I know it is possible to
Mm,
sort of make it work for yourself as a career, as something that you're interested in. But I think go in with the understanding that it is also entirely possible that it's not going to happen. It's not going to
mm,
work out necessarily in the long run. But even if it doesn't, just having that sort of experience and knowledge under your belt, you don't have to be an archaeologist with it, right?
mm-hmm.
As I said, my parents both have history degrees. Neither of them work as professional historians. So it's, just having some university experience, learning how to research, how to write. An undergrad degree is not the be all end all of your career. So
Yeah.
don't worry if you can't find a place forever in that field or if you change your mind 10 years down the line. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's yeah, that's a very good point. So what are those like transferable skills that you think you gained through archaeology that you can take in a different field and still be useful?
Yeah, archaeology, we necessarily think of it as you're being outside, you're digging, or in our case, you're diving. And finding stuff. But obviously that's not the only thing that you do in archaeology. There's a lot of research involved, a lot of writing, and I think those are the sorts of skills that if you practice and work hard to improve at them, especially when you're in undergrad, you can do anything basically. As we know, in this day and age, being a good writer is an increasingly rare skill. And so having that ability to be able to research and then write out your findings, write out a field report, for example, or a research paper is very valuable. And I think in a few years, it will be even more so, and people will be very glad to find new university graduates who can write an essay that makes sense and on their own power.
That's
so those
very nice.
are the most important transferable skills that you would get out of an archaeology degree, sort of the same way that you would get them out of almost any degree in the humanities. But
yeah, that's very nice to hear. And I think I agree with everything you just said. So just to wrap this up, do you have any closing remarks for us? Anything you would like to say to the outside world now that you're giving the platform to do it?
Sure. I would say if you want to get into maritime archaeology, it's never too late. As we know, George, you don't even have to know how to swim to be in maritime archaeology. So hang in there, guys.
Wow. Those were some wise words. Thank you so much, Leo, for being with me tonight. Thank you for this talk. This has been amazing. And I wish you the best of luck in your career, life, and future endeavors.
Thank you, George. Best of luck with your DPhil.
Thanks. I need it. Bye.